Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. I'm delighted to welcome Carlos Hernández to tonight's programme to discuss how an understanding of modern monetary theory offers socialists an opportunity to explain how a socialist government, using MMT as a lens to understand the monetary system, could create a good society. But mainstream political discourse continues to peddle the myth that taxes fund public services. Even John McDonnell, when he was Jeremy Corbyn's shadow chancellor, fell into the same trap and went to great lengths to explain how Labour's manifesto would be paid for through various tax adjustments. So perhaps we could start there, Carlos. For a lot of people watching the programme this evening, it's kind of counterintuitive, really, to say that taxes don't fund public spending. Can you tell us what tax is for? And if it doesn't fund public spending, how do governments raise the necessary finance to pay for things like public services and social security?
Well, that is the very main point of MMT, of modern monetary theory. The taxes don't finance the spending of the government, but they have three different goals. They give value to money. They promote the different economical activities, and they control inflation. But they don't finance anything. Money is a creation of the state. So in order to be able to spend, the government has to, in order to be able to collect taxes, the government has to spend first. So that's why spending doesn't, a collection of taxes doesn't finance spending. It's the other way around.
Yeah. And I mean, as I say, a lot of people are, they still see, I think, the economy as working like a sort of a household budget, which is something that Margaret Thatcher was very good at sort of conning people, I suppose, into thinking that that was how the economy worked. What would you say to people who are interested in this topic about how they should go about disabusing people of that notion?
Well, it's very simple. I would ask them a question that I have heard from Stephanie Kelton in the past, which is, when was the last time you went to the supermarket with the money you print in your house? That is what the government does. The families and the private companies are not the government. The families and the private companies use the money that the government creates. Therefore, the government cannot run out of its own money. They create money from thin air in the central banks by keystrokes in the central banks. So they cannot run out of money. The way that they should understand money is that the government, through public spending, mobilizes real resources in the economy. So money is not scarce. Real resources are, and public spending is a way to mobilize all those real resources. So the financial resources are always there. What you really have to focus on is real resources. So the government can purchase everything that is on sale in its own currency. So you can, in principle, buy everything that is sold in your own currency, including the unemployed labor force. If you are unemployed, means that you are looking for a job to get a salary. Well, the government can always hire you because they cannot run out of money. That's the way they should understand money.
Yeah. And what about, some people who are critical of MMT say, and skeptical of it, say that you would just simply create inflation by spending like that. How would you address that argument that people say that MMT is an inflationary proposition?
That is the second stage, to put it that way. First, they say it's impossible, that you can run out of money. And once they understand that this is very possible and this is the way that economy works, they say, well, but that creates inflation. But in my opinion, the biggest biggest advantage or the biggest point of MMT is that it is a method to create full employment without inflation. The job guarantee based on employment buffer stocks allows you to have permanent full employment without having inflation. Because once you establish a minimum wage, the wage of the job guarantee, the price level always stays close to the salary of the job guarantee. When the recession comes, then more people will join the job guarantee. That means that prices will stay stable. And when there is a boom, the workers will not be able to push very high wages because the employer can always find someone in the pool of the workers in the job guarantee to keep levels of salaries close to the levels that they always are, the levels of the job guarantee. So in this way of understanding the economy, it is not that price stability comes because you have employment. That is what neoliberalism says. You have to choose between employment or price stability. What MMT explains is that price stability is a consequence of full employment.
Yeah. I wonder maybe now, Carlos, whether you might sort of just unpack what you mean by, which we sort of started to touch on there, what you mean by fiat socialism. And you've written about fiat socialism. You've explicitly talked about how modern monetary theory, can be used as a tool by socialists. So just sort of explain your worldview. What would fiat socialism actually look like if we were to implement it in Britain, say, or across Europe?
Well, a definition of fiat socialism would be the achievement of the goals of socialism through modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory, as said before, is a method to obtain full employment without inflation. Now, what are you going to use the full employment without inflation for? You can use it for whatever you want. MMT is, like you said, a lens to look at reality, but it's not a regime. It's not a political system. The full employment and the price stability that you obtain through modern monetary theory, you can use it for whatever you want. And you can use it to obtain the goals of socialism. And that is exactly my definition of fiat socialism. The achievement of the goals of socialism through modern monetary theory. And I point to 5 goals in socialism. These 5 goals are written in a book of Stuart Chase called The Road We Are Traveling, and they are a guarantee and permanent full employment, full and prudent use of natural resources, that is number 2. Number 3 is a guarantee of food, clothing, health services, and education. 4, social security in the form of pensions and subsidies. And number 5, a guarantee of decent labor standards. In my opinion, any system that provides these 5 goals could be called socialism. And the way to achieve this in a sovereign, monetary sovereign country is through modern monetary theory.
Now, we had a conversation offline about this, Carlos, before we came on air, that Marxist economists are skeptical about MMT. How do you address the Marxist critique of MMT? What would you say?
Well, actually, I think that it's not all Marxist. There are many Marxists who understand this kind of reasoning. For example, Bill Mitchell. But what I think that about the other kind of Marxists that don't agree with modern monetary theory is that I don't consider modern monetary theory incompatible with Marxism. I think that the labor theory of Marxism is absolutely shared by modern monetary theory. The only origin of value is human work. That's why modern monetary theory focuses on full employment. So, on that sense, there is not a contradiction. They are both absolutely compatible. Where I think that original Marxism and modern monetary theory don't agree is in the concept of money. If you read the Capital and other writings by Marx, he talks about barter, he talks about gold, he talks about silver, but he doesn't talk about a fiduciary economic system. And that is where modern monetary theory comes in and say, no, well, the conception of gold, of money, like something that you can run out, like a material thing that you can run out and therefore you cannot spend, is way in the past. Since 1971, we don't have a gold standard anymore. That means that the governments cannot run out of money anymore in their own currency. So that system applied by Marx doesn't apply anymore.
No.
That is the main difference.
Gee, I mean, I've heard some people say, Carlos, that were Karl Marx alive today, that he would probably be an MMT adherent. Actually, I mean, he was writing at a time about the theory of money and so on, based on the circumstances that prevailed back in the 18th century. Would you agree with that?
Of course. I mean, he was right. They were in a gold standard, so you can't really run out of money. But at the end of the first volume of the Capital, he talks about fiat money, and he doesn't go very much into it. In my opinion, he has an ad hoc reasoning about fiat currency. He talks about fiat currency being useful to conquer other countries, to conquer colonies, to exterminate indigenous people. Well, the question is very obvious. Well, if you can use that fiat currency in order to do that, which is true that it was used to do that, why cannot you use it to spend from the government perspective? Why cannot use fiat currency in order to spend from the government perspective? And that is something he doesn't get into, really. No. And MMT, what MMT does is to fulfill this hole in the reasoning of Karl Marx, in my opinion.
Yeah. I wonder if you could say a little bit as well about how the world, a little bit more detail about how the world changed in 1971 when the Bretton Woods agreement came to an end, because I guess some people watching will be familiar with Bretton Woods, but I suspect a lot of people have never heard of it, other than it's a place, I think, somewhere in the south of England. Could you just say what the Bretton Woods agreement was and what happened? Why was it jettisoned, and obviously what the implications of that have been ever since?
Well, in Bretton Woods, what you had was a peg currency, or the international currencies were pegged to the American dollar and to gold. You could exchange 33 pounds of gold, I think, or grams of gold, I don't remember, for $1. So you could peg your currency in that way. In 1971, Nixon, the so-called Nixon shock, ended all this. The American administration was going through a lot of problems because of the war of Vietnam. They had a lot of spending, and they were afraid that they couldn't keep up the spending of the war through the Bretton Woods system and the gold standard. So what they just did, they just closed down the office of gold, and they just kept on spending with their own currency without any restriction. So from that moment on, the dollar was not convertible to anything. The rest of currencies would fluctuate in the international markets depending on their value, and the American government could keep on spending as much money as they wanted without any kind of restriction. And that applies for the rest of the currencies too. And that is what happened in 1971. From that time on, the governments cannot run out of money. From there on, they can spend as much as they want. That doesn't mean that they can spend as much as they should, that they should spend without any limit. Of course, inflation, for example, would be a major issue not to spend without any restrictions, but they can. They have the possibility. It doesn't mean that they should, but they can.
Can you just say as well, then, Carlos, what tax is actually for then? What do we use tax explicitly for?
As I say, taxes give value to money. In order to have electric light, you have to pay taxes, because if not, you don't have electric light. In order to have water, you have to pay taxes. You have to do many things through taxes, and you have to pay many things to the government with taxes. So taxes give value to money. That is the main characteristic of taxes. They also control inflation. If you have too few goods for too much money in the market, what you want is to reduce the amount of money in the economy, and therefore you elevate taxes. So you eliminate money from the market, so the price goes of the rest of the goods go down. Same thing if you are in deflation. If you have too little, if you have too many, if you have deflation pressures, what you want to do is the opposite. You want to lower taxes. So the taxes are a method to control inflation, and they also promote the different economic activities. For example, if you are worried about speculative pressures in the stock market, well, you can always raise taxes to lower the profit in the stock market. If you are worried about the housing prices because there is a lot of speculation, well, then you can raise taxes on the housing market. So it helps you to promote the different economic activities that you want in your economy.
Right. Yes, indeed. Let me just go to a few questions that were put in to me, if I may, Carlos, before we go to Sean to get the comments from our viewers. But there's I've got about three or four questions here from people who have written in prior to the program starting this evening. And the first one is this: it's a progressive socialist government would almost certainly be met by stiff national and international resistance. If such a government were to come to power and used Britain's sovereign currency to nationalise or invest in state-owned production, how could or should it respond to capital flight, currency destabilisation and stagflation, as happened to Harold Wilson's Labour government in 1967 and Francois Mitterrand's socialist administration in 1981? How would you respond to that?
I would say that there are three different questions there. To begin with the first one, we have to understand the economic decisions as a trilemma. You have to choose between three things. You can choose between maintaining an exchange rate peg, maintaining an interest rate peg, and allow capital mobility. From these three things, you can only choose two. And in modern monetary theory, what you normally opt for is not to have a fixed exchange rate. So you let the exchange rate fluctuate. You fix the interest rate at 0%, because interest rates are only welfare for the elite, for the people who already have a lot of money. And if you are worried about capital flights, you can always use capital controls. So the flights doesn't happen anymore. So between these three things, you have to choose two. And the way to address that is not having a fixed exchange rate. You let your exchange rate fluctuate. That means that the speculation in the in the international money markets is very much ineffective against your currency, and you fix your exchange rate at 0%. And if you're worried about capital flights, you just impose capital controls. In that way, you can always control your economy without any major issue. What happened in 1967, the stagflation problem? You had high levels of unemployment and high levels of inflation. MMT addresses that question from the perspective of real resources. Inflation is not a monetary phenomenon. Inflation is always a real resource phenomenon. And this has been like that through whole history. In 1967, you had the oil crisis. And throughout the 70s, you had the oil crisis. That is a crisis of real resources. And there, you cannot do anything with your economic policy. If a fundamental real resource like oil is scarce, you are going to have inflationary pressures. If you destroy most of your industry, like after the First World War in Germany, you are going to have inflationary pressures. If you have a crisis in your production of goods and services, you are going to have inflationary pressures. What would have been the solution there? The solution in 1967 would, for Wilson, would have been political, and say, look, guys, we have to sit down here because we have a problem of real resources, and we both have to agree, the workers and employers, to lower our income until this crisis is over. Once this crisis is over, we can take on normal life. But if we keep on, if we don't make sacrifices until this crisis is over, we are going to have inflationary pressures no matter what we do, because we cannot live without oil. And the third question that they ask about is Mitterrand. Mitterrand got into government with the help of the Communist Party. The Communist Party was part of the government, and they made all kinds of reforms. But they forgot the most important reform, or the most important policy in every left government, which is the job guarantee. If you control your currency, like back then France, you can always have 0% unemployment with a job guarantee. And that would have stabilized the economy a great deal. They didn't do this, and they kept the control of employment levels in the hands of the private sector. And that was the reason why the left government lost after this coalition between the socialists and the communists. The level of unemployment cannot be decided by private companies. The level of employment is decided by the government. And if you want to have a full employment policy, full employment and permanent employment policy, you are very welcome to do it. And then you can use the level of full employment to stabilize the rest of the economy. That was the main problem in the government of Mitterrand.
Why do you think it is? I mean, do you have any insight, Carlos, as to why is politicians are so dense in these matters? They seem to be constrained by non-existent constraints. I mean, they don't, in this country and indeed around the world, we don't really see governments using the powers at their disposal to do the kind of thing. I mean, these are left governments as well. I'm not talking about right-wing governments, but left governments. I've never really, well, maybe, I don't know, unless you've got some examples where they have, but I don't know. What is it with politicians, do you think? Do you have any insight? I mean, what the problem is?
Let's just focus on the last sentence I said before. You keep the level of employment at 0% forever. and you take away the power of employment from the private sector. That is in itself a way to get rid of capitalism. Capitalism has never achieved this, and it will never achieve this. If you don't have a job guarantee, and if you don't have a full employment permanent policy, then the private companies will have huge amounts of power in the economy, because at the end of the day, they will decide who they want to hire and who they don't want to hire. And by implementing a job guarantee, what you are doing is taking away that huge power that the elites and the rentists have over the rest of the economy. And that is something that so far no government in the West has tried. Of course, we have full and permanent employment in the Soviet Constitution and in the East Bloc, in the Socialist Bloc. And that was the only moment when they could really accomplish this. They couldn't run out of money, and they would hire everybody who wanted and could work. And in order to avoid that kind of socialist transformation of society, no government so far in the West, not even the communists in France in the 80s, had the guts of doing this. And that is also a reason why I am proposing fiat socialism, because it is about time to say that the level of unemployment in every single society has to be 0%. Everybody who wants and can work must have a decent paid job. And that is a political decision.
Of course. And we desperately need that commitment. It's certainly something, and I would be committed to, but we've got to obviously convince a lot of other politicians, and hopefully through programs like this, we can help to raise people's consciousness about these matters and encourage them to be putting pressure on politicians and maybe would-be politicians watching this evening. But just on that point about the job guarantee, though, Carlos, what sort of rate of pay would a job guarantee job command? I mean, would it be at a very low level? Would people be unable to, pay for the basics in life, or would it be set at a much higher level, maybe at the European decency threshold level? I mean, what sort of rate of pay should the job guarantee actually command?
Well, the first thing that would disappear are the jobs that don't pay a decent salary. So if you have a business and you cannot pay a decent salary to your workers, you should not have a business. Your business shouldn't exist.
I've said that.
If you have a business, it's because you can pay a decent wage to your workers. And what the job guarantee is exactly that. If you don't pay me at least as much as the job guarantee, I am not going to work for you. I'm just going to go to the job guarantee. So in principle, you can put that level wherever you want. Of course, you have to adjust it to inflation levels and standards of living, and you can also make it compatible with the other 5 points I have mentioned of in fiat socialism. For example, I think that it is not enough with a job guarantee. I think that we should also have a housing guarantee. And that would also be a great way to fix the level of taxes. For example, if you have a housing guarantee and you say you can pay 25, 20, 30, whatever the number, % of your salary, and then you will have a house. The house will not be yours, it will be a rented house, but everybody that pays 25 or 20 or 30 or whatever % of their salary will have an access to a public housing. Well, in that way, you have solved the problem of taxes. You control inflation that way. You give value to money that way, and you control the housing speculation in the housing market. For example, you can also do that and and make compatible the job guarantee with the rest of the 5 points of the Fiat Socialism. So
Yeah.
what is the level of the salary of the job guarantee? The level that guarantees decent living for everybody.
Yeah, so it would certainly be substantially higher than the Britain's current minimum wage, which isn't really enough for people to live on. So I think what you're saying is job guarantee would pay a salary which is commensurate with being able to fully participate in society. As if I've got you correctly there. Let me just go on to a couple of other questions then, and then I'll go to Sean and see what people have been saying who have been watching. The second question that was sent in was, if state production isn't implemented, spending through private capital for infrastructure, etc., will not change the nature of the business cycle, will it? Roosevelt's New Deal failed to create growth and reduce unemployment to acceptable levels. And despite extraordinary government spending in World War II, the United States still had very high poverty and unemployment rates.
Well, what you do with this kind of policies is you implement a counter-cyclical measures. If you have a recession, what you implement is a anti-recession policy where you grow up in your public spending in order to keep levels of employment at full employment, and you do the contrary of what the European Union does. When we get into a recession, what does the European Union do? They implement austerity. That is exactly the opposite of what MMT says. In order to change the cycle, you have to implement anti-cyclical or counter-cyclical measures. If you have if the unemployment in the private sector grows, you have to grow your job guarantee through public spending in order to keep full employment levels. And is that the only way to get to full employment? No. Keynesianism was also on this page. They said, if you have unemployment, it's because you are not spending enough. And you have to spend as much as necessary to have full employment. Well, the problem with that is that if you don't have a job guarantee based off employment buffer stocks, you can create inflationary pressures. And that is one of the main points and one of the most important points of MMT. Private sector is not there to hire everybody who wants to have a job. They are there to make a profit. And in order to make a profit, if they are inside of the law, they have all the right in the world to do it. But the responsibility of keeping full employment is the responsibility of the government. So in order to make full employment and price stability compatible, you need a job guarantee. So it's not the only way but of achieving full employment, but it's the best way of doing it. What is the problem with Roosevelt? Well, the problem with Roosevelt is that he didn't go far enough. He had kind of a job guarantee, but he stopped his own policies once the recession was mainly over. The book of Stuart Chase that I mentioned before was exactly an attempt to make the New Deal permanent. We have to keep the full employment levels forever. Through the spending in the Second World War, they got to full employment levels, but he was very much worried about what would happen afterwards. Now, when we don't have a war, now that we don't have so much public spending, we are going to go back to the crisis situation where we will have massive unemployment, where we will have massive poverty, and that's what we don't have to allow. And that is exactly what he wrote about. Roosevelt, after the New Deal, talked about the government being like a household. So exactly what the neoliberals say, saying that we have to tax in order to spend, exactly the opposite of what the New Deal did. So that was the problem with Roosevelt. He didn't go far enough, and he didn't go long enough with the New Deal.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it, that Roosevelt was using the household budget analogy, something that Thatcher adopted latterly, and yet Beardsley Rummel, who was the head of the Nat Fed, I think wrote in 1946 that taxation for revenue expenditure is obsolete, and yet you've got Roosevelt making the very opposite point. It's a curious state of affairs. So, I mean, these issues have been known about for some time, but it seems, I don't know whether politicians are willfully obtuse or what, but clearly misinformed.
It's a clear contradiction, and he actually took the United States out of the gold standard. We also have to say that, in order to be able to implement the New Deal, he took the United States out of the gold standard, but then he put the country back in the gold standard again. Doesn't make any sense.
No, indeed. And just for those people, Carlos, who are maybe not too familiar with what we mean when we talk about the gold standard, could you just sort of unpack that a little? Just sort of say, what would it mean when the currency is backed by the currency is on the gold standard? What does that mean?
Well, what it meant is that the government had to keep exchange rate in gold. So you had to have enough reserves of money in order to keep the exchange rate of gold. If you come with gold to the central bank, you had the right to ask for money, and the other way around. If you wanted to exchange your money for gold, you could also do that. So the level of spending of the government was limited because you couldn't spend so much that you couldn't keep the exchange rate with gold.
Yeah, you basically had to have it. Your expenditure then had to be backed by gold reserves too.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can always write down the spending, but at the end of the day, you can run out of money because you of course, through history, every time that the governments have been in trouble, for example, in a war or a major recession like a New Deal, like in the big recession in the United States, the first thing they did was to forget about the gold standard. So that should have given them the clue that the gold standard was the problem. You didn't need the gold standard. You just had to get rid of that. Of course, that brings us to some technical problems. Before the telegraph was invented, it was very difficult to keep the exchange rate between the different currencies updated. You needed some kind of anchor to keep the exchange rate between currencies stable. And that was, in principle, what the gold standard was for. It was more a technological problem. But ever since the telegraph was invented, you could transfer information from one part of the world to the other, and you could keep the exchange rate of the different currencies updated by the minute. After that, the gold standard didn't make any sense whatsoever.
No. A couple more questions, then we'll go to Sean. Just a short one. This one is: does public spending in a recessionary environment lead to private investment? Yes,
there is a very common fallacy inside of the neoliberals, in the neoliberals' mind, which is the crowding out fallacy. They mean that if the government takes over and they spend a lot in the government, then there will not be enough money to spend in the private sector. Well, it's actually the other way around. Public spending equals private savings. So when the government spends, the private sector saves. So what the public spending does is to increase the power of spending in the private sector. So that's why in a recession, the government has to increase their spending in order to take the private sector out of the crisis.
And then finally, is this question before I go to Sean, as I keep saying, if the state doesn't take on production because of the issues that we raised in the first question, how does the state force private domestic investment based on both credit and borrowing, QE for private production, and reinvestment of accumulated profits derived from MMT spending? If the state simply spends money on private production, for example, infrastructure, there is nothing to force investment in new production. Then the capital that's accumulated in the hands of capitalists from state expenditure can easily flow into asset acquisitions, causing inflation, or flow out of the country and cause exchange rate-based inflation. And then he says it doesn't seem that MMT can address this, but I think you've sort of touched on that a little bit already, Carlos, but then if you want to just sort of respond in more detail to that final point.
One very important thing to understand is that the scheme, the model of modern monetary theory works no matter how big the private sector is. Your private sector can be only families and only families without any company, and the MMT model still applies. So you can choose how big you want to be, how big your private sector is. But if you want it to be only families, that's fine. What the modern monetary theory and fiat socialism system says is that if the private sector is not covering the necessities of the population, the government can take over any moment. If there is a necessity that normally was covered by the private enterprise, and the private enterprise has decided not to cover that necessity anymore, the government can take over. The government, through spending, can cover that necessity with a public company. Nothing stops the government of doing that. So it is very unlikely that the private sector says, well, I am going to stop making a profit, because I could make a profit by selling my goods and services to the population, but in order to, to boycott the government, I'm not going to do it. Well, in that sense, the one who loses the most is the private company, because the government can take over its activities and they will not make any money anymore. And then they talk about the asset acquisitions. If you speculate with asset acquisitions, the very simple thing you can do is to tax them. That's why also taxation controls the different economic activities I said before. If you don't produce anything and you go to the stock market and you speculate with assets there, well, the government can actually tax you as much as it wants. You can make $1 million every day, but if I tax you 99.99% of that million, you will not get anything. So taxation also applies to control this kind of speculative activities. MMT is normally used by people who think that the financial sector should be very small. Banks should be very small. What it should be much bigger is the productive sector, the production. But the financial sector should be very small, and you can do that with taxation.
Yeah. In the end, it seems to me, Carlos, that it's about political will. If politicians have got the will to do these things, then they can do them. And it seems to me, anyway, that MMT gives socialists a tool to actually, bring the speculators, to bring the capitalists to heel, to deliver the kind of good society that we all want. It just seems to me a kind of common sense. I always talk about common sense socialism, and I just think, MMT very much lends itself to that notion of common sense socialism. It is a tool that can, I think, be used very positively in the hands of a progressive socialist government. And I would urge people, to embrace the kind of fiat socialism that you're talking about, and to demand that we use that and go forward, and that our representatives, embrace it and use it as a mechanism to bring about the sort of society that we've been striving to achieve all these years. But let me bring in Sean now, because I'm sure there'll have been some comments from our viewers, and see what they've got to say.
Good evening. Welcome to the Backroom chat room, where we've been taking your questions and comments. Before we go to Carlos and Chris, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and click the icon bell for notifications. You can also join Resist Movement for a People's Party from our website resistmovement.org.uk. And this episode will also be available on your favourite podcast platform every Friday. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions and comments that have come in tonight, Carlos, for you. Jorge Amar says, by the way, Carlos, I love your T-shirt, no pasaram. Jonathan Cooper says, I see MMT as a way to explain how the economy works and dispel capitalist myths more than anything else. You talked about the housing market, but house prices in the UK are continually rising. So the rich get richer and the poor can't afford to buy. How does MMT address this issue?
Through taxes and through public guarantee of housing. The government can create as much housing as it needs in order to keep everybody in a house. So if you tax the speculation in the housing market, you will get rid of it. And if you offer everybody a house or a flat for an amount of their salary, you will have everybody housed without any kind of speculation in the market whatsoever.
But this would hurt the capitalist model of controlling money, controlling taxation, controlling housing market. Do you think that that could really happen?
Oh yes, I do. I think there is something very important to have in mind. The ideological fights are primarily not economic fight. They are an imaginary, and they are a fight in the imagination of the people. People first picture themselves in the new world that you are presenting, and if they picture themselves in a world that they find more attractive than the world they live in, is when they turn their attention to if it is possible in economics or not. I think that people don't want to have a socialist model where their level of control over their lives is lower than the control they have now. And that is exactly what I pretend with fiat socialism. We have to have the means in our hands to control how big is the private sector, how big is the employment, how nobody will decide where are we going to live, how much money we are going to make. They will not decide what kind of job I will have for the rest of my life. That is something that the people can and must have in their own hands. But there are certain things that must be guaranteed. The guarantee of the 5 goals of socialism. Everybody has to have access to that.
Can just for our viewers, can you tell us what the 5 goals of socialism are?
Well, that is what I said at the beginning. Those are the 5 goals that Stuart Chase, in his work of 1942, The Road We Are Traveling, wrote. And they are: number 1, a guaranteed and permanent full employment. Number 2, full and prudent use of natural resources. Number 3, a guarantee of food, clothing, health services, and education. Number 4, social security in the form of pensions and subsidies. And number 5, a guarantee of decent labor standards. In my opinion, we have to focus on these goals. And if we are able to guarantee these 5 goals to everybody, we can call that system socialism, because such a system has, or such a situation has never been achieved in a capitalist society, and it will never be, because they will never give up their power to decide the level of employment in the society.
Wouldn't that cause all-out war with the capitalist system?
Excuse me?
Wouldn't that cause all-out war with the capitalist system?
Well, in the films, the good guys win if they are more than the bad guys. So if we unite and we can picture ourselves in this society, that's why I said before that this is also an exercise of imagination. If most of the population, the working population, the people who live or make a living from their work, picture themselves in this situation, that is very possible, it is at hand, they will not be stoppable. The elites can say whatever they want. They will not be able to stop this revolution or this movement. As I say, what I'm saying is possible no matter how big the private sector is. So I have no problem with having private ownership of the production of means, as long as they play by our rules. If you want to play the game, you are welcome. I think that people understand very well that you can put a business and you can win, you can make money inside of the law. I think that people don't have any issues with that, as long as you play by our rules. If you think that this is absolutely unacceptable and the private sector gets out, well, there you go. The private sector is not needed to implement the measures that I have talked about.
Yeah, somebody commented in the chat room that the capitalist system is sitting on trillions of pounds, trillions of dollars, and they're not investing. They're not investing in people. They've got far too much money. You know, how much money do they need when people are struggling? Let's go to Angela Pezzak now. She said, MMT isn't a theory that most of the public are familiar with. They still insist on the Thatcher trope, which is that we have to manage our budget as you would with a household. How can we get this message of modern monetary theory across to the general public?
Just before you come in, Carlos, your link's very poor, Sean, and we're not hearing you well. I wonder whether if you turn your camera off, whether that might improve the audio. But did you catch that question?
Yeah.
Carlos, yeah.
As I said before, this little joke that Stephanie Kelton sometimes does is very good. You know, you can ask the people, when was the last time you went to the supermarket with the money you print with the printer at your house? Never. And that's exactly the difference between a household and the state. The state prints the money it uses in the supermarket, and they cannot run out of that money. That is the difference between you, a private citizen, and the government. So let's start from there. You cannot do what the government does. The government can buy anything that is on sale in its own currency. And the question that you said before, people with too much money. Well, people with too much money, we don't need the money of that people in order to spend. They can have as much money as they want, but that doesn't mean that we are not going to be able to spend as much as we want to in order to achieve our goals. And on the top of that, we can tax that persons as much as we want, so they will only keep the money that we allow them to keep. So the amount of money that people have doesn't mean that they are not going to allow us to implement any kind of measure.
Yeah, I mean, Margaret Thatcher infamously said once, Carlos, you probably recall, that the problem with socialists is that they eventually run out of other people's money. And of course, that just kind of reinforced this notion that the economy ran like a household budget. And yeah, that got a lot of traction. But of course, it's complete nonsense, as we know. But Sean, can we hear you any better now? Speak to us.
Okay, so yeah, going from what you've just said, Chris, Angela was asking, are there resources we can signpost people to raise the awareness of modern monetary theory?
What are the resources?
No, yeah, are there anywhere that we can signpost people to?
I didn't listen.
Oh yeah, the question was, Carlos, is where can people find out more information about MMT? What resources are available?
Well, there are, in my opinion, three main authors in modern monetary theory that everybody should read. The first one is Bill Mitchell from Australia. The second one is Randall Wray from the United States, and Warren Mosler from the United States too. So all the books and all the papers that these three persons have written are absolutely essential to understand modern monetary theory. Bill Mitchell, Randall Wray, Warren Mosler.
Okay.
Yes, and can I just say as well that Bill Mitchell runs I think it's a weekly blog, actually, Billy Blog, at Billy
Daily,
Blog.
daily.
It's a daily blog, sorry, I thought it was weekly. Billy's relentless, and there's a mine of information. So if you're not following him on Twitter, I would urge you to do so. I think it's at Billy Blog. Yeah. And an amazing resource of information. And then, of course, there's GIMS, the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies, gims.org, GIMMS.org.uk. If you log on to that website, they produce a lot of information. And indeed, they've published quite a bit of work that Carlos himself has written. In fact, I'm just looking at something now. Carlos's article about fiat socialism is actually or one of his articles anyway, is on there. So that's a good resource. So at Billy Blog and the Gower Institute, really good resources, and obviously the others that Carlos has just identified. And if you want to read a great book about modern monetary theory, get Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth. It is a brilliant book. It's also available as an audio book. I can understand it. So if I can understand it, anybody can understand it. It really is a very well-written book, and it does sort of unpick a lot of the myths that are surrounding the way in which our economy and the way our politicians basically spin a yarn to us. So those are good resources, I think, to go to. But go on, Sean, last couple of comments before we close.
Okay, are you hearing me any better now, Chris?
Not much, so we might as well have your picture back on.
Okay. We've had a lot of comments from Ben Kavanagh, who has been putting some really good comments on the chat. He says that the level of unemployment sets wages. Capitalists depend on a reserve army of labour. Capital will never accept full employment. The army will be engaged in a coup before anything close to full employment would be achieved in a recessionary environment. As you reduce unemployment, wages rise, and significantly. Wage prices are not static. It would completely disrupt capitalist profits. They will declare all-out war. Carlos is making no analysis of the loss of profits that these policies would entail to the capitalist class and what their reaction would be. So what's your thoughts on his comments there, Carlos?
Well, that is the position that Kalecki, the so-called Keynes of socialism, took about this question. He proposed inside of the socialist bloc, actually he was from Poland, a very, very similar alternative to fiat socialism. But he, at the end, he said, well, this will not be able we will not be able to implement this in a society where we allow private enterprising, because the reaction by the elites would be so tremendous, would be so powerful that they would never allow this. Well, I believe in reason. I think that if we gather as enough people, we are talking about an enemy that is very small. We are talking a very, very small percentage of the population, less than 1% of the population, maybe 0.1% of the population. If 99% of the population understands what we are talking, I think that this could be possible in our society. But as I said before, if the private elites, the private enterprises decide not to participate in this kind of society, well, then they are very welcome to leave. We don't need them in order to implement these measures. The size of the private sector is irrelevant.
Yeah, and I mean that's a bit of a counsel of despair, I think, from Ben. To be honest with you, we do know that the elites would certainly resist, and one of the things I was arguing for when I was still a member of the Labour Party and going around the country arguing for greater democracy in the Labour Party, but was also for greater democracy in the economy. We needed to democratise our party, the Labour Party, in order to democratise the economy. And I made the point that the elites would not let us do what we wanted to do without a fight. And indeed, there was a general went on the record just after Jeremy Corbyn was elected, threatening that if he were to pull out of NATO or scrap Trident or cut the defence budget too much, that they wouldn't allow that to happen and they would use fair means or foul. So I was making the point, we need to build a mass movement because we may need to be on the streets to defend a radical socialist government. And that's a really important lesson. It might sound a bit dramatic, but, you know, the elites will not give up their power without a fight. And that's why we have to stand together. And Carlos is absolutely right, in my opinion. And going back to what Percy Shelley said in his fantastic poem, The Mask of Anarchy, in the aftermath of the Peterloo massacre, the final line was, "Ye are many, they are few." And as Carlos has just said, they are a tiny number in percentage terms. We are the many. And if we stand together in solidarity, a common theme that we keep going on about on these programs, then we're incredibly powerful. And that's what we need to hold true to. And that's what we need to build, that solidarity. But look, we're out of time. We've gone over time. Carlos, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting session again, as always. We look forward to seeing you. Carlos has agreed off screen to participate in the Resist Festival in October. So we'll be talking about the themes that we've been speaking about this evening in a little bit more detail. Carlos, I'm hoping, will also be in attendance at the Resist at Rialto event, which is the parallel conference that we're organising at the same time and in the same location, or in the same city anyway, as the Labour Party conference this year. So if people have had their appetites whetted and they're interested in the issues that Carlos has touched on this evening and want to look at it in a little bit more detail, you'll have an opportunity to see Carlos in person at those events later in the year. Thank you very much indeed for watching this evening. Apologies that we've gone over time slightly, and hopefully we'll see you next week at the same time, 7 o'clock on Wednesday. Good night.